Mr. Fox, you are next. Yes, breathe now. Yes, Mr. Fox, 5 minutes or less for you, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci aux membres du comité pour cette occasion.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Non-partisan think tank headquartered in Montreal. Our mission is to conduct research on issues of importance to Canadians and their governments and bring academics and senior decision makers together for discussion and debate based on that research. As some of you will know, the IRPP has had a long-standing research interest in strengthening Canadian democracy and its institutions. Our most recent initiative, directly related to today's hearing, consisted of a consultation process with Canadian and international experts that led to our March 2013 report entitled Issues Arising from Improper Communications with Electors. The report was distributed to committee members, so I'll dispense with a description of the process and focus my remarks on the recommendations coming out of our work as they relate to C23. Sure. First, let me note that there are portions of C23 that are supported by our work and echo our own recommendations. Regarding improper communications with electors, provisions related to increasing penalties for existing offences, creating new offences, receive strong support from our experts. The report also calls for requiring parties to document their use of voter contact services and preserve those records. Creating a voter contact registry, as is proposed, would be a positive step forward in regulating communications with voters. However, other provisions proposed in C23 stand in sharp contrast to the conclusions drawn by our experts. For instance, our group felt strongly that the public education role of Elections Canada needed to be enhanced and considered a crucial element of its mandate. To see it curtailed in the way that is proposed, therefore, seems to be a step in the wrong direction. Enumeration used to play a vital role in informing citizens about elections, but with enumeration gone, the public awareness campaign takes on renewed importance and should be preserved. Some have raised some good and important questions about the success of past efforts in increasing voter turnouts. I think that's an important point and should be studied further, but if the ad campaign is ineffective, I'd suggest that means get a new ad agency, not stop advertising. I raise a similar concern regarding the elimination of vouching. To be clear, our experts did not examine the issue directly. It was beyond the scope of our initiative. That said, we did stress that a primary goal of the system should be to make voting as easy as possible for as many citizens as possible. Be vigilant about fraud, absolutely, but when in doubt, err on the side of the voter. The elimination of vouching seems to run counter to that principle and may further marginalize groups that are already marginalized by the elimination of enumeration and its replacement by the permanent voters list. I would add quickly that I think the discussion you were having in your last session about alternatives to vouching was an important step forward. My point is simply that we don't know enough, I think, about the consequences of eliminating it outright to simply proceed without due consideration. With regards to what's not in the bill, our group also noted that even in legitimate communications with electors, there are significant policy gaps that need to be addressed regarding personal information held by party databases. As parties become more sophisticated at collecting information about voters, we need a privacy protection regime to regulate how that information is stored, used, and protected. Voters would be surprised to learn how much parties know about them, and probably shocked to know that the information is not protected. If there's still scope to add to the bill, I would urge the committee to consider seriously a regulatory regime to frame how parties manage and protect our personal information. Finally, our experts felt strongly that when making any changes to the Elections Act, Parliament should do its utmost to seek as broad a consensus as possible before it proceeds. Given how fundamental the Act is to the conduct of our politics, we should avoid making changes on division and aim for all-party support to the extent that that's possible. In light of what I think is a strong consensus on some issues covered in C23 and the great divisions that remain on others, I would suggest that the committee consider splitting the bill in two. Move quickly to enact the provisions that address improper communications with electors and perhaps other sections of the bill, and hold back on the public education role of Elections Canada, vouching, and perhaps other issues that would benefit from further debate and reflection. Alors, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you. Perfect timing. Mr. Gunn, you're up. Good to see you again, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. That's the fastest 15 minutes that's ever gone by. Wow. Thank you so much. My name is Taylor Gunn. I'm the founding president of Civix. I've spent the last 12 years working with students, teachers, schools, governments and election agencies to encourage youth democratic participation. My organization, Civix, primarily provides experiential civic education programming for elementary and secondary school students. Our rationale is that the best way for a young person to learn about their democracy is to experience it rather than read about it in a textbook. Our farthest reaching and longest running program is called Student Vote. It's a parallel election for students under the voting age. Many of you have participated in it. Basically, it helps schools put democracy on the curriculum throughout the course of an election campaign. Kids go home and they engage their parents in the election. They meet the official election candidates. They run the vote in the school for their peers, and they vote on the official election candidates. In the last federal election, it was the second time we had over 500,000 students from just under 4,000 schools across the country. The cost of the program in partnership with Elections Canada was approximately $750,000. That equates to about $1.32 per student. We now offer other programs between elections because we know that being a citizen means more than just casting a ballot at election time. You might have heard about the student budget consultation that we coordinated with Finance Minister Flaherty and the opposition party leaders, including Ms. May. Thank you. It was all about getting kids to understand the federal budget. And then we recently launched something this school year called Rep Day, which many of you have taken part in as well. We were trying to help you get face time with your local high school students to break down their occasionally negative stereotypes of politicians in the political process. Yeah, what? But I'm here with you today because I want to work with you on this act. We've enjoyed the privilege of working with Elections Canada over the past 4 federal elections through Section 18. This draft now of the Fair Elections Act would disempower Elections Canada from supporting us working in schools across the country. This is very important to me because in 2015 we think it's possible to be in half of all schools in this country and increase our numbers significantly. I don't feel that I can do that without the support of Elections Canada. So we've got just 2 short recommendations for you, but I first wanted to touch on something that's very important to us. To get into schools, the authenticity and credibility of being in partnership with Elections Canada is critical to be welcomed into schools. It is an irreplaceable badge of honor. Everyone knows that Elections Canada is our electoral agency, and it can't be replaced with support from, say, a Fraser Institute or a Tides Canada Foundation or another group, for example. It's critical. For us, it's critical to maintain that relationship. The 2 recommendations we have, and the first one just may be obvious for us, is we've enjoyed working under Section 18. It's allowed us to come to them with new ideas. Obviously, it's up to interpretation what they decide to support or involve in, and maybe you'd like to narrow that, but our first recommendation would be keep Section 18 as it is and reserve the time of the committee to focus on some of the other major issues like vouching, etc. Our second one, and you could look at the last page of our little booklet here we gave you, with the new Section 18, the sidebar says communication with electors. What we do is we teach the when, where, how to vote. If that could be changed, it's not even really in the bill, it's just describing what the new section is. If that could be changed to communication with Canadians, I think that would allow us to have permission to teach the when, where, and how to vote with the support of Elections Canada to non-electors, those being under the voting age. Outside of that, I can't believe I did that in 4 minutes. I'm so sorry. That must have been like too fast. I'd like to say thanks for having the opportunity to have 4.5 minutes. I'd just like to point out that in our opinion, the most significant and important actors in our democracy right now are teachers and our schools. Schools play such an important and integral role in civic education. They don't need a whole curriculum around social studies or how to be a citizen. They just need great teachers that care about this. They can bring these opportunities into the curriculum, and I hope that you'll help us continue to do that.
Thank you very much. If I ever need a speaking team, you're it. I apologize without looking at the translators for how fast some of you were speaking. We're going to go to a 7-minute round, starting with Mr. Lukiski.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. Before I begin with my questions, I just want to, for the record, perhaps set something straight. There was commentary that was provided by Mr. Lamrou's mirror image, Mr. Sims, who was with us during the presentation by Mr. Neufeld, and that is that Mr. Sims brought the example forward of a woman in a care facility in his home province, in his riding actually, who he stated would not have been able to vote without the voter information card, because he said it was the only possible piece of identification that showed where she lived. I point out that's absolutely false, because contained in the Act is the ability for seniors who live in care facilities to merely get an attestation from the head of the facility saying this woman lives here. That's all they need. So she would have been able to vote despite the protestations of Mr. Sims, and I want to have that on the record. Now, my question, I think I'll first start with Mr. Fox, because as I think most Canadians know who are paying any attention after the last election, the biggest controversy surrounded the robocall situation in Pierre Poilievre. The still unknown Pierre Poilievre, who apparently had a fairly widespread and apparently fairly orchestrated attempt of voter suppression. Now, the Fair Elections Act, Bill C-23, deals with that very situation in that it uses the CRTC, as a central repository for all voter contact services to register. And in fact, without going into all of the details, because I know, Mr. Fox, your organization did fairly extensive studies on voter contact services, but when I asked the former Chief Electoral Officer Kingsley, who testified before this committee on Tuesday, if he believed the provisions contained in the Fair Elections Act would prevent that very situation from occurring in the future, he said yes, an unequivocal yes. I would like your opinion, since your organization did so much work on this very issue, about the government's proposal on regulating voter contact services and the role of the CRTC that is contained in Bill C-23.
Thanks very much. I'm not sure we can answer that question in absolutes, in the sense that there will always be an exception. What I would say is I think the provisions that are contained in the Act, which echo a lot of the recommendations that we put forward in our report, would add a deterrent by raising the bar on what happens to you if you get caught. But I think in a response to 2011, the forced creation of a paper trail and the keeping of records all the way to who authorized the communication, who was communicated to, and what the script was that was used in those communications, I think will really help after the fact if there needs to be an investigation, which in itself would be a deterrent. The last thing I would say is I also appreciate that the provisions aren't technology specific. And that you didn't fall into the trap of going too far down into the specifics of, was it a cell phone versus was it something else, was it a recorded message versus a text, which will allow you to keep up with technological advancement.
I guess on behalf of our chair, I can say that now we do have 7-minute rounds. You can probably take a little bit more time and be deliberate in your answers, because I would like to get a fulsome response to this. Let's concentrate on the CRTC. In effect, the Act will make the CRTC almost like a one-stop shop of sorts. Do you agree with the approach of using the CRTC as a central repository to try and record all of these calls that are being made and have an accurate record of who is making the calls, what they are saying, and to whom they're directed? Is this something that your organization approves of?
Absolutely, and I think the addition of requiring the service provider to register, I think again is an added safeguard if we ever need to go back to things that have happened in the past, and we'll share some responsibility and make it more explicit. So I think that's positive, and you will have seen in our document that actually the CRTC, current and former, had representatives in our group at our roundtable, and I would never pretend to speak for them, but I would say that there was a lot of support for the idea of the two organizations, Elections Canada and CRTC, working together to help regulate this. So I think there'll be a lot of support even from them in acting in that way going forward. Thank
you for that, and I think your comments echo what Mr. Kingsley was saying, and Mr. Kingsley did go a little further. You mentioned that you were not here to give any absolutes. He, in effect, did. He said his examination of the bill, with the provisions contained regarding what we commonly know now as robocalls, would prevent that orchestrated voter suppression attempt by whoever Pierre Poilievre is from occurring in the future. One thing, however, still is, I guess, up for discussion, and that is how long records should be kept. In Bill C-23, the Fair Elections Act recommends that all records are kept for 1 year, so that there is a record of what's happening and what occurred in terms of script, calls made, calls received, that type of thing. Some of the opposition is criticizing that. We feel 1 year is a pretty good balance, because right now there's no requirement to keep records for any period of time. One of the reasons we're suggesting 1 year would be adequate is that if there is to be another situation, hopefully there will not, but if there's another situation where something like a voter suppression through a robocall system is alerted, all probability the investigation would commence almost immediately. And with the trail that we propose to regulate now, we feel that 1 year would be adequate. But does your organization have any thoughts on whether keeping records for 1 year is adequate, too little?
That time period is beyond the scope of our report. I would say, however, that 1 year is definitely better than what we have now, which is nothing. I completely agree with you. But given the marginal additional costs of keeping that record once it's been put together for perhaps a longer period, may not be too onerous on parties and service providers, and may give more time for issues and events to come to the surface after an election. And so I'd be open-minded about it being longer than 1 year, for sure.
You have about 4 seconds. Madam Des Rosiers, you wanted to add something very, very quickly on Mr.
Very quickly. At UFT last week there was a big debate, and one of the recommendations was that it be expanded to 5, and someone went as far as 10 years. But certainly I think there was the idea that a bit longer would just make the appearance all clear.
Super. Thank you. Mr. Scott, 7 minutes from you today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to say I'd like to give the last 2 minutes to Ms. May, if that's possible, and if you could call me at 5 minutes.
We'll stop you at 5 and give the last 2 to Ms. May.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I appreciate the line of questioning with Tom and Mr. Fox, and I think it's fair. Everybody, this is going to be better than nothing, the registry system. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say Mr. Kingsley said unequivocally yes, that it would prevent in an absolute way. He had criticisms that numbers won't be kept and that 1 year was too short. That's the minimum. And we also talked about off the books. Anybody who's really going to engage in a concerted effort these days knows that the system's in place and will use sophisticated technology, perhaps proxy servers, off the book servers, burner phones, etc. And the problem is, the system, the registry system, doesn't really account for that. And so I'm just wondering if, Mr. Fox, whether you would agree that the failure to include things to do with enhancing the investigative powers, the other end of deterrence is people will know that it will be properly investigated. The lack of compulsion of witness, I don't know whether you agree that it should be there, but that as a fact, it will make it more difficult to investigate. Is that true?
Again, that goes beyond the scope of the work that we conducted. There was certainly a lot of discussion in our group of experts about whether or not we should consider enhancing the investigative powers of Elections Canada or the Commission of Canada Elections, rather. And so, generally speaking, I think our group would have said there's room for improvement. We didn't get into the specifics of what those proposals might be.
That's great, thank you. And I also do want to thank you, as well as to note the fact that Professor Des Rosiers pointed out the problems of restrictions on research, and under the current Section 20 sub 1, the Treasury Board's approval will be required for the hiring of temporary specialists. The hiring of you to do that robocall research in future would require the Treasury Board to approve that. And I just want everybody to know that that kind of work is precisely the kind of work that the Chief Electoral Officer should not be second-guessed on. So I thank you for the work. I wanted to also quickly ask Ms. Loat. The Minister has a propensity to take praise and blow it up. So when you say, quote, Mr. Poilievre is correct in highlighting that parties and candidates play a critical role in encouraging participation, I don't disagree. The fact of the matter is we do. We do that primarily through trying to encourage people to vote for us for the substantive reasons. I think that's a very valid way to try to increase participation. My problem is with his all-or-nothing vision that that's the only way citizens should be motivated. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody realizes that you're also recommending keeping the general public education function of Elections Canada, and that parties themselves should continue and do a better job motivating as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In our submission and also in my remarks, we had 3 recommendations on increasing citizen engagement and education both during and in between elections that would be done in nonpartisan as well as multipartisan ways. We do believe that political parties and candidates have an extremely important role to play in engaging electorate. And our research suggests that there's a big bridge between where they could be and where they are, at least in the eyes of citizens. And I do have concern about the low credibility that political parties have in the eyes of the public. And as I said, particularly given the quite generous public subsidies they receive. So I think efforts, I mentioned 2 points about Elections Canada. One, strengthening the role and encouraging them to do a better job. Secondly, having a innovative funding and research program that's based on what we know works, whether Elections Canada is asked to measure results and share those and communicate those so that there's a broader understanding of what we can do to encourage greater voter participation. And thirdly, I do suggest that some of the additional funds provided for political parties in this bill be allocated to voter education so that political parties are sending a message that they are serious about the very severe decline in participation, particularly among young people in this country.
Great. Thank you for amplifying your presentation. And now I think I'm just out of time, and Ms. May can go.
Very convenient. Ms. May, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to start by thanking Craig Scott for being so generous with his time. I don't think we ever hear enough from witnesses when they're on panels and forced to speak so quickly. So I want to ask one question, which I will ask each of you to speak to, and I hope you can get as much as you can into your time and still breathe. All of you represent nonpartisan, non-profit organizations with expertise in the issues currently plaguing Canada in terms of voter turnout and fair elections. I appreciate your evidence today. I want to know from each of you, do you believe C-23, the so-called Fair Elections Act, will help or hurt the health of Canadian democracy?
Well, thanks. I'll give you the answer you don't want to hear, which is it's not passed yet, which means there's lots of room for all the changes that I think we've suggested. That's my answer.
I would agree with Taylor. I think there's a lot of room for important changes to the bill, but I think if those changes come through, it will help.
It's very important that some attention be paid to the robocalls issue, but if it can be split off and the rest of it be engaged in a more fruitful debate, I think that's what we're suggesting. Improvement is needed.
I think I probably agree with everybody. There's some good aspects, but lots of opportunity for improvement.
From my point of view, and having had a chance to speak to the bill at second reading, I made it clear I also support the regulation of robocalls and the way that that's being handled. I think the key significant pieces that need to be reformed before the bill passes are relating to getting rid of the vouching provisions, getting rid of the voter ID cards, and getting rid of Elections Canada's role in public education. If those pieces aren't improved before passage, would you believe this bill does more to hurt or help Canadian democracy?
Very short answer from each. You have a second each.
I do think that diminishing the role of Elections Canada will be bad for Canada.
Agreed.
Based on our work, it would have to be no.
My health card, embarrassingly enough, is my only piece of official ID, and it doesn't have my address on it. So my wife couldn't vouch for me right now. That's my personal opinion, but obviously I have a couple of years, hopefully, to fix that.
I'm proud of anyone who at your age doesn't have a driver's license. Thank you very much for your testimony.
I have the TTC.
Thank you, Ms. May. We'll move on to Monsieur Lamoureux.
I appreciate the quick answers. I can tell you, I don't think that there is anyone outside of the government that is actually proposing that we get rid of vouching. And so it's reassuring when we hear from nonprofits or independent groups coming before the committee, just reinforcing how critically important it is that we retain vouching. And I understand that there might be some need for some amendment or ways in which we can maybe modify it, but you don't have to kill vouching. That's an important aspect to our democracy. I wanted to pick up on the robocalls, because that is an issue that tens of thousands of Canadians are very familiar with, to the degree in which literally thousands of phone calls were made to Elections Canada because of what had taken place. One of the biggest criticisms towards the election bill was that Elections Canada was not being afforded the opportunity to compel witnesses. I think, Mr. Fox, you had indicated something to the effect of what happens to you if you get caught. Getting caught can be a problem for the simple reason is they just have to say no comment. They don't have to show up. My question to you is, how important do you think it is that Elections Canada or the Commissioner have the ability to compel a witness to provide testimony?
I think giving the investigator the ability to compel witnesses would be a positive addition to the bill.
Okay. The other issue that I'm not too sure who raised it, it might have been you, Mr. Fox, and I think it's an issue that we don't hear enough about, is the whole issue of privacy. We do have these huge data banks. All political parties have data banks. It's very limited in terms of what's there to protect the voters on this particular issue. How would you recommend, or who should oversee? Is it something that it should be the Privacy Commissioner? Should it be Elections Canada? How do we protect the voters with these data banks, in your opinion?
I'll leave it to experts to make a definitive view on that. I would say the expertise currently resides at the Privacy Commission, so I would start there. And I think looking at the Privacy Act and extending certain provisions to political party activity without, and I think it's important to say, without going all the way to preventing political parties from communicating with voters or knowing more about us. I think it's important for democratic activity to make sure that political parties can do that legitimately and without a too heavy regulatory burden. But it is almost nonsense in the information age that we're allowed to keep those databases without any kind of oversight about what happens to information that's about us.
Yeah, and I think that's the major point here. And in fact, something could have been incorporated into the legislation that at the very least would have dealt with the issue. Fair comment?
Fair comment, and I would say a separate bill could deal with that as well, but it's definitely a policy gap that we identified, that others have identified, and that needs to be dealt with.
Right. Mr. Gunn, I had read your part of your report, and it was interesting. On February the 17th, 2004, you make reference to a resolution, and this is when it states, and I'll quote right from it, that the House direct the Chief Electoral Officer and Elections Canada to expand its initiatives to promote the participation of young Canadians in the electoral process, and that these initiatives include making available educational material to schools and other organizations and supporting parallel voting opportunities for prospective electors during federal elections, including making available polling materials and publications of results of such parallel voting, and that Elections Canada work creatively with such groups as Kids Voting Canada, Scouts Canada, Guides Canada, teachers and others, and provide regular reports on these matters to the House of Commons through the Standing Committee on Procedural and House Affairs. So there was, and this is something that was supported by all parties back in 2004. Now, this legislation does not do that, and I'm wondering if you might want to provide comment on that.
I put this in just because it was hard-earned to engage Elections Canada at the beginning. to do this. This has been a 10-year effort, and they said no to us many times, and it might have just been that they weren't yet ready to interpret the existing Section 18 as something that would allow them to, say, work with future electors, like what we were proposing. And luckily, MPs in the House disagreed, and they basically told Elections Canada at that time to work with us. That name, Kids Voting Canada, was the first name we came up with. So they put that in it, and the very next day, we received a call from Elections Canada asking us to go to Ottawa and meet with the Chief Election Officer to begin to speak about how they could potentially support us. And I'd like to point out, too, they didn't always support the entire cost of the student vote program. It started with in-kind contributions, no cash towards our time, for example, and through much heavy negotiation is probably a polite way to put it, and also an accident of the 2008 federal election falling on Labor Day weekend, which I don't think they were prepared for. They had to, if they wanted us to operate, cover the full cost, and now since that time they've done so.
Yeah, and I guess I raise it because we have seen a flip-flop in attitude from the government. At one time they supported Elections Canada, and they voted to go out, reach out for Elections Canada. And today what we're seeing is quite the opposite. All four presenters articulated on how important it is that Elections Canada have the ability to communicate with the public. And if the amendment is not brought forward, could you see this as good legislation by tying the hands of Elections Canada in any form if that amendment does not succeed? And just a very quick yes, no from each presenter would be much appreciated, or 3-second comment. Yes.
I think I made my position on that clear in their remarks.
We need to preserve the public education function for sure.
That's what I said. I think it's not going to be good for Canada if Elections Canada cannot continue in a public education function.
And I agree, and I also think in my remarks I tried to strengthen it further by arguing that they could actually be doing a better job. I think there's been some concerns articulated. Mr. Reid, who was here earlier, I heard him articulate some concerns about the advertising earlier, and I think if we had a more rigorous approach of assessing what worked and didn't and have that shared, I think we could make amendments to encourage that sort of behavior that might even strengthen it further.
Thank you very much. Again, I caution the members about asking complex questions with 2 seconds left in their round. Mr. Richards, for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to follow along on the education part of it as well here. I think what we're talking about is voter turnout, and we're talking about the education and the information. And I think there's two things that drive voter turnout. And that's, I think the first one is motivation to vote, and the second one is information about voting. So obviously information is the responsibility of Elections Canada. That's quite clear, you know, letting people know how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. It's their own data show that they've been doing a fairly poor job of it. After the last election, when talking to young non-voters, there was reports of not knowing where to vote. 25% of them saying not knowing where to vote. 26% not knowing when to vote, or 19% not knowing how to vote. So obviously that would have played a role in their decision not to vote. So that's obviously a barrier there. And I wanted to just ask Mr. Gunn, maybe Ms. Loat, I want to ask you both to be quite brief because I've only got 3 minutes left at this point. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of your sense, because that tells us about the information part of it, but the motivation part is the part I'd like to ask you about. Can you give us any insights on your feelings on what motivates a person to vote? Obviously the approach of Elections Canada, there's millions of dollars spent in the last several years, and it doesn't seem to be working. So tell us what your feelings are, just again briefly, What motivates someone to vote?
Sure, Mr. Richards, I just had a problem hearing on that last one. I just wasn't sure if you're implying that the money spent on the student vote program wasn't working, or by Elections Canada on just outreach in general.
What I'm really asking you is just to tell me what motivates someone to vote, in your opinion. Like, what's the motivation?
I also would like to take this moment just to talk about, for a quick second, because that's probably all I have, Mr. Preston, is, and I may be like either wrong or a total outlier on this, and I brought this up with you personally. I don't believe so much in the access or information barriers. I actually think that those, and I put them in a category called...
I'm sorry I have to ask you to be very brief. Like, if you
sure,
get the point
okay.
of what
I call those excuses. Those are excuses that people use if they are not going to vote or they didn't vote in an election. The real barrier is, I think, interest, knowledge, sense of civic duty. If you're interested in something, you're going to make it a priority.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you. I'll have to stop
Sure.
you just because I want to allow Ms. Loat, and I do have one follow-up question for you both. So, very brief.
Terrific question. We run a program called Democracy Talks that works with young people and newcomers to Canada, and so we run focus group work with them. Three things that come up that on the motivation side that I think are deeper than what you can get at from some of the statistics that you've probably been presented. One is there's an overwhelming sentiment. These are people who don't participate. That voting.
I remind you just to be very brief. I want to get a follow-up.
They don't see voting as something that Canadians value. It's not introduced to people in citizenship. It's not taught well, often in schools, with the exception of student vote. And many people say their friends and family have never encouraged them to do it. So that's one. Two, voting is not the first step for most people. Most people who have to engage, and thirdly, it has to come from a trusted intermediary. Okay. So those are three further barriers on motivation.
I need to get to my second question. So I think talking about motivation, I look at that really as being a role of us as political parties, as politicians, to encourage people and motivate them to get out and vote. I look at the last couple of elections in the United States, for example, and I think you would probably both agree with me. What motivated people to get out to vote there? It was being inspired by a politician, being inspired to get out and vote and be part of issues, and someone that inspires you. Would that be something you would agree with, yes or no?
So
framework.
So there is there's research done on this. These are great questions. The candidate and the party absolutely matter. A secondary thing, though, where voter turnout went up where it hadn't before, was work that was done with intermediary organizations who had trusted relationships with people in communities. So I think it's not just candidates or just schools. It's the two together, and that's, I think, what's so critical about Section 18, is that, I've made hopefully some good suggestions on that dimension that would allow both multi-partisan as well as non-partisan efforts be made to encourage greater participation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Christopherson, you're starting off the format round that apparently you're sharing with Madame Latondres, so please.
I am. Thank you, Chair, and it saves me from having to say it. You already did. Thank you. I would also like to use my time to advise of a notice of motion. Earlier today, the government attempted a drive-by smear, and in addition trying to find a political diversion from the train wreck that is these hearings in terms of their shredded Bill C-23. This is a referral from the House. Given the fact that it attacks my party and my leader, we feel it should be dealt with immediately. Not only are we in compliance with all the rules, but we're proud of the outreach work that we're doing, and therefore I move the following motion. That pursuant to the motion adopted by the House of Commons on March 27, 2014, relating to the parliamentary functions being performed in offices of the official opposition, the committee invite the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and also invite the Right Honourable Prime Minister to appear before the committee to address the many partisan activities undertaken by his government, specifically by the Prime Minister's Office, PMO, and the Conservative Research Group, CRG, and that furthermore the current study on C-23 be extended by the same number of days as those scheduled for the study on the referred motion. And with that, I turn the floor over to my colleague, Madame Latondres. Thank you, Chair.
If I can be on the order.
And I'm not going to the motion today. He's given us the notice of motion. Madame Latondres, 2 minutes left. Well, a minute and a half, or 2.5, or some combination thereof.
Merci. Thank you. Thank you very much for your appearance here today and for your thought on what can be done to improve the election system. My question is to all four of you. I would like you to tell us, in your opinion, what effect what will be the consequence of abolishing the vouching system and the abolishment of the voter identification cards? What will that do? What will that do to diminish for electoral participation? Well, one of the things is that we really don't know what the impact of these decisions will be, and in actual fact, we feel that it could be very dangerous to do things that might limit the base and the pool, rather, of voters. And the combination of these two factors could represent a restriction on any voter, and that would be a loss for our democracy. We really want to embrace the cautionary principle that we should be facilitating people to exercise their suffrage. Yes, I agree entirely with Madame Des Rosiers. My first concern is this: we don't know what the impact will be. We don't know who will be affected more than, say, the other person. Will there be regional differences? Will there be demographic differences? And I think at the very least we have to know more about it and better understand it before launching ourselves into this change.
This, the more that can be done to increase and encourage access to voting is probably, well, I think is good, and the evidence I've seen presented suggests that vouching will harm that principle.
I'll leave these three to be the experts on vouching, and the previous CEOs. I can only offer my personal experience with my health card.
2 seconds. Thank you, Madam Loat, just for finishing right on time. Mr. Reid, you have 4 minutes to finish us off, please.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I am anxious indeed that we wrap this meeting up in time, because I'm chairing another meeting in this very room, in that very chair, on the critically important issue of international human rights, 9 minutes and 30 seconds from now.
In for you, Mr. Reid.
Thank you. My question, well, I suppose anybody can answer it, but I wanted to direct it to Taylor Gunn. Taylor phoned me, and I suspect some other members of the committee beforehand. We had a good discussion. It was very helpful, so I appreciate that. I also like your multicolored presentation, which is, I'll show this to my webmaster as a thought as to how we could goose up our own presentation. And finally, before I actually ask you a serious question, I can't help but notice in your helpful compendium of participation in different schools that where you've listed off all members of the committee. In my riding, Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington, in 2011, I won the student vote. 31 schools registered, 2,884 ballots cast, and just for the record, that is more votes cast than in the chair and two vice chairs' ridings put together.
It was too easy in the chair's right. Yes.
And no one's out. Just saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question relates to the educational role you guys have. One of the problems that I have felt exists, I've felt this for many years, is that there is inadequate education as to how to vote. And I think you and I may disagree a little bit about whether people vote because they are insufficiently motivated versus encountering genuine barriers to voting. But we do know from, just finish my thought and then I'll let you answer, but here, Taylor, here's what I wanted to say. We do know from the CEO's report on lack of youth participation, young voters. Yeah, he divided the young people up into 5 groups. And in 3 of those 5 groups, when they cited reasons why they hadn't participated, 3 of the groups, and I can't remember which of the 3 subcategories it was, but indicated that one of the primary reasons, lack of voter information materials, voter information card, which among other things tells you where to vote. It does serve as a prompt. Many people carry these things into the poll. I do, as actually I did before I was a voter. I get to remember when election day is now, obviously, as a candidate. But before, it was a helpful reminder, oh, here's where the advance poll is, that kind of thing. Here's when the advance poll is. They don't get those things. And what I'm getting at is, I think it would be useful if, as part of your education process, because you're actually in the schools for kids when they are too young to vote, but they're at home. Then they move away and they can vote to go to college, but now we've lost track of them. Helping to educate them on how to exercise that franchise a couple of years in the future would be an enormously useful service. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm recommending you do something like that, and I'm just going to ask you to comment on that or general issues with relation to that.
That's a great recommendation. Hopefully other members can agree that it's a great recommendation so that I can incorporate a great recommendation from the committee rather than just one partisan member. I think that the voter information cards are I've always found them to be useful. I think voters actually now have a habit of recognizing and using those, and obviously that should carry on. I think, I don't know if this is so relative to the committee, but certain election agencies across the country have attempted to explore whether or not they could share information with their provincial counterparts, say the Ministries of Education, for example, so that as young people went through school, they were automatically put on the registered voters list. Does that help them if they move away to school and they're sharing a place and only one person has their name on that house's residence? I don't think so in the case of voter information cards. But if it comes to be that this passes and it is, Section 18 is restricted, we'll focus our information that we provide to schools. Everyone will put more energy into just the when, where, and how to vote. I think the bill's trying to imply that someone shouldn't be trying to tell people why to vote. And I can understand that, but the why comes from the when, where, and how. At least in our program, when you go into a school with your fellow candidates, you're not teaching the why. The kids figure out the why. When they go home and talk to their parents, that's where they learn the why. So I feel that even the previous Section 18 and the current Section 18, they could be interpreted in exactly the same way. It would be great just to have the committee really clarify that, especially around things like civic education and public engagement.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Gunn. To all our witnesses, I can understand we tend to always go over when witnesses are passionate about what they're here to present to us. So thank you all today for what you've done. I've got just a thank you for coming and sharing with us a couple of pieces of information for all of the committee. If you could please just bear with me for a second. But we do thank our witnesses and excuse them. We talked a bit about amendments that will be needed. We're suggesting Friday, April 25th at noon, if you're submitting amendments to the clerk. April 25th at noon. Ask me how flexible I'll be on that. Clause by clause will be scheduled to start at what would be our regularly scheduled meeting Tuesday, April 29th, the 11 a.m. start. Pardon? Well, I'm suggesting that we'll... Pardon?
That yet. We haven't dealt with the other... to the best of my knowledge, I stand to be corrected, to the best of my knowledge, all we've agreed on so far is next week. We still have further discussions to talk about going forward.
We have a delegation from Scotland with some informal gatherings about electoral reform and other issues they'd like to speak to us about. Monday, April 7th is when they're here. I'm suggesting a half hour in the morning. The vice chairs, myself, or the whole committee, or whoever would like to. A notice or a letter will come out from me asking for that, please. Pardon me?
That meeting
will be here. It'd be in center block someplace. I would hope, Mr. Lamoureux. With direction from the steering committee, we've started scheduling for next week. We've finished scheduling for next week. We've finished scheduling for the rest. It's not all available because we're still doing some invites. This committee will be working Monday evenings 7 to 11. Tuesday its normal time 11 till 1. Tuesday evening the same time frame 7 to 11. Wednesday evening the same time frame 7 to 11, and its normal meeting time of Thursday 11 till 1. That will happen through all the weeks that we're studying this. I've promised that we would give as much opportunity for every witness asked for to be here and any witness to send briefs and the like. That will accomplish that. We've also set the size down from 4 to a maximum of 3 on groups like we just had, to try and make that work a little bit better too. So if you give the, as the steering committee did the other day, allowed the chair and the clerk to move forward on that and started that scheduling, and with the competent work of the committee, I'm sure we can accomplish the rest. I would assume then that sometime after 11 on Monday night is when we'll deal with Mr. Christofferson's motion. Sorry, David, that was just a joke. Anything else for the good of the committee today? We are adjourned.